So I'd like to thank Nicky for coming along today, and I'll leave it and pass it over to you.
Thank you, Dwayne, and it's really, really lovely to be here with you all today in this absolutely lovely spot on this horrendous day, weather-wise, but hopefully not a horrendous day in other respects. So I'm going to share with you some thoughts, ideas, and some bits of research, and then hear from you. But before I did that, I wanted to tell you a little bit about me and how I've come to be fanatical about evidence-based communications. So firstly, there's the fact that I've spent 15 years working in communications for different organisations. I've learnt a lot in that time, but I've often felt that our communications approaches were limiting us. I've spent the last 3 years attempting to introduce an evidence base to how we talk about human rights and equality. I also work with Catsnake, brilliant storytellers and filmmakers who challenged me to think very differently about how to convey a message. But when I was considering what it is day to day that has really informed the perspective that I think I bring to this, I realised that it's my other role that has had most impact on me. And my other role looks a lot like something you may have seen recently. So, this felt very, very familiar to me, only my kids are even crazier. Having small children is a constant reminder of a lot of the principles that I think need to underpin how we view communications. Toddlers don't respond rationally to information. Small children hate being told they're wrong. And the words you use when you're attempting to reason with kids can backfire massively. Any parent in the room will know this. And I think that all of these principles apply to communications with adult human beings as well. And one of the reasons that I think this clip of this chap, Professor Kelly, being interrupted by his kids struck such a chord was that it reflected a reality that parents face every day. For many of us, we're trying to be serious and professional in the grown-up world, like this. But actually, our day-to-day reality feels a lot more like this. And that's basically my life, right there. And so when he was interviewed about this afterwards, Professor Kelly said, "My real life punched through." And when we think about how many more people were interested in his brilliant, chaotic real life than in his dry, expert, factual persona, I think there's a real lesson here. He definitely didn't go viral for his views on South Korea. So there's been an awful lot of talk recently about the post-fact, post-truth world we live in and the limitations of facts. We're all becoming more aware of the need to speak to people's emotions and values. And there's been so much on this in relation to Brexit and Trump, something I've talked about a lot recently, and I'm not going to rehash that today. But before I talk about some of the facts that I've worked with, and I think some of the lessons that emerge from them, I wanted to have a pause and a think about how we feel about this idea of the post-fact, post-truth world, because how we feel is really important. And I don't know about you, but I like to process everything through the medium of dated British comedy. So I thought I'd share a clip by the comedian Stuart Lee on exactly this issue.
Because I think a number of kind of crash generalisations going about the Scots and one country. I don't believe any of them again. In fact, you do meet people who have very fixed notions about other British people. I'll give you an example of what I mean. I got in the cab in London in December. About 5 minutes into the journey, apropos of nothing, early on a Sunday morning, the cab driver turned around to me and he said, "I think all homosexuals should be killed."
Now, whatever you think of that, Glasgow, as a statement, you have to admit it's a bold opening conversation. With a stranger. And I was a bit taken aback. I went to him, "Oh, why do you think that?" And then there was a pause, because he'd obviously never had to go to the next level of the argument. Fraternising mainly with cab drivers, so well, that was just accepted. So, and he said, "Well, After a moment, he said, well, because homosexuality is immoral. And I said, this is honestly true, I said, I'm not sure how much weight you can afford to place on the notion of morality in this argument, because morality is not a fixed thing, it changes its parameters culturally, historically, over time. I said, for example, look at ancient Greece. To this day, we still take most of our most fundamental principles about ethics, aesthetics, philosophy, medicine, science, whatever, from ancient Greece. And yet, I said, in ancient Greece, love between two men, far from being immoral, was actually considered the highest, most ethical, most profound, if you will, most moral form of love that there could be. So all I'm saying, I said to him, is I'm not sure how useful morality is, given its flexible nature, as a cornerstone of your argument on this subject. And then he said to me, this is honestly true, he said, well, you can prove anything with facts, can't you? For a minute I went, yeah, and I thought, hang on, that's the most fantastic way of winning an argument I've ever heard. I'm not interested in facts. I find they tend to cloud my judgment. I prefer to rely on instinct and blind prejudice.
So obviously this is an extreme and probably made-up scenario, shared to be funny, not to reveal a wider truth. But for me, I think it does reveal a wider truth. And that's that we can feel really uncomfortable with people who we feel disregard facts. And we can see post-truth as something that affects other people who are stupid and probably racist. And I think we miss out on a lot if we see the world in this way. So I'm going to talk a bit about our human rights research. A lot of things have changed in the past year or so, and the research that I'm about to share was carried out before that, over a few bursts in 2012, 2014 and 2015. A group of UK charities recognised that there was a growing issue around narrative and public perception here. And this is where we began. So that's just a snapshot of what was a fairly extensive media discourse analysis that we did. And our research showed how successfully politicians and the media had influenced public opinion. People felt human rights had gone too far. There was a strong association with undeserving groups, particularly with terrorists and criminals. The media reporting on cases like Abu Hamza and Abu Qatada and the political rhetoric on the Human Rights Act had created a powerfully toxic narrative. We segmented the UK population based on people's views and found there was a large conflicted group, around 40%, who were open to both negative and positive human rights messages, but largely hear the negatives, or certainly the messages that make them feel more negative. Very few people in this group see human rights as relevant to their own lives, and this was the key. And all of this matters. It matters partly because public opinion has been used by politicians as the key justification for backward steps on human rights laws and protections. So the previous Justice Secretary, Michael Gove, said, "Human rights have a bad name in the public square. They have become associated with unmeritorious individuals pursuing claims through the courts that don't command public sympathy." So in other words, the legal changes were necessary to give the public the perception that something was being done. But when we tried to speak to the persuadable 40%, we really struggled to get it right. We tested arguments used by organisations and defenders of human rights, and we attempted to talk in a new way to build relevance and to make that connection. And our research was all about identifying the extent to which messages made people feel more positive about human rights, not just whether they agreed with them. So here's a snapshot. It didn't go very well. And I'm not expecting you to be able to read this. I just wanted to show you all the red. Most of what we tested completely bombed, and some of it actively created a worse impression of human rights. And this is with people who are open to hearing positive messages. We've screened out the people who aren't interested and the people who aren't likely to change their views. So this is the 40% persuadable and the 20% that are pro-human rights. And part of what was happening was that we were throwing facts at the situation. So facts like, we have a long history and tradition of support for human rights in this country, and Winston Churchill's government helped draw up the rights that the Human Rights Act and the European Court protect. This is such a favourite of human rights defenders, but it doesn't do anything for public audiences, even those who are already positive about human rights. The other thing we tried to do was some gentle myth-busting. So there are relatively few human rights cases involving illegal immigrants, but they are blown out of all proportion by politicians and the media. So myth-busting is one of those things that you probably shouldn't get me started on, because I have such strong views about its effectiveness or otherwise. But in terms of the data that we did here, it was fairly conclusive that, you know, attempting to introduce a concept in order to disprove it just didn't work. And in our focus groups, where we were able to provide more detail and we were to go into the facts and to provide more evidence, it wasn't just that people didn't agree with it and it didn't change their views. It actually made them really angry. It was a really, really vitriolic response people had when we presented them with what we felt was the facts. So in the next stages of our research, we managed to learn from all of this and to craft more messages that worked for the persuadable audience. We took seriously what people were telling us, and we worked harder to frame rights in a way that made them connect and feel relevant. And we made a film with Age UK to bring some of this to life, which I will show now. Hopefully.
Excuse me.
Dad, these aren't your clothes. Put you in someone else's clothes.
What's this one's name?
So, who wants cake?
What's your name? It's Charles. That's your name.
So the film performed well and had a pretty good reach for the scale of the project, but we still struggled to get this new way of approaching human rights communications to be adopted more widely. For the very factual world of human rights experts and lawyers, our evidence and facts didn't feel right. Last year and this year started to change that. So a different story is playing out and it's shifting things. And many more organisations are recognising the limitations of a very factual-based approach to communications. Before I move on from human rights in the UK, and I'm aware that I've actually lost sight of what's interesting when it comes to talking about human rights communications, so I apologise if it's very much not. But I wanted to share one last nugget. So this is our first piece of research, and I returned to it recently. And I think it's really important when you do this kind of work to keep looking back at it, because each time you read it, you get something different from it. And you have to remind yourself and kind of keep bursting your own bubble. So I returned to it recently, partly in response to Brexit and thinking what that meant in terms of talking about human rights. And with it in mind that after Brexit, the big battle on human rights in the UK will be around our membership of the European Court of Human Rights, which is an institution that is separate to the EU, but is often confused with it for very obvious reasons. And I was reminded that only 8% of people in the UK know that the Court of Human Rights in the EU is separate to the EU. So we're actually gearing up to protect something that most people will believe they're already rid of. And this made me wonder where else, when we campaign, we're talking to an extremely small subset of people. And the answer to that is quite often. So this headline sums up what is actually true, that there is very often a wide gap, a huge gap between expert knowledge and public understanding. And it's not just in the UK, so I don't want to give that impression. I found a really interesting statistic, which is that 43% of Americans believe that we'd reduce global warming if we stopped punching holes in the ozone layer with rockets. So this is, I think, quite funny and quite shocking, but it also unveils, I think, a bigger issue, which is, for me, that on some of the most important issues of our time, we're often a world away from mainstream public opinion and understanding. On which note, it's time for some more dated comedy.
What's happening? What is that? I'll tell you what that is, right? That is loads of money! It's all mine, right? Loads of money. You can't have one penny, mate. It's all mine. I'm a plasterer, see? Bush, bush, shum, dollop, dollop. Lovely job. Loads of money! Well, mate, how much you earn a year? Is that all? I'm on that in a bleeding day, mate. Loads of money! Well, I ain't been a plasterer, though, right? I'll go down the dole, you know. Not a sign on, nah, just to wave loads of money at them. Their eyes, they glow up when they see all my money, they glow up. I don't give them none. I'll go down the betting shop, I'll put the whole lot on horse. Horse comes in last, I put bleeding more on. Horse comes in last again, I put bleeding more on. Horse is dead, I put bleeding more on. I'll go down the butcher, I say, oi mate, I want £1,000 on that piece of meat to win the derby. No, second folks, put some bleeding more on. That's what the old butcher calls me, bleeding more on.
So that was loads of money, a reaction to and comment on 1980s capitalism. He was massive. I was very, very young at the time, very young. But I remember him being all over the place and everyone using the catchphrase. And he was totally extreme and felt to the left like a grotesque manifestation of everything that was wrong with the world. Only that's not how other people saw it. The Sun newspaper took it on as a celebration of Thatcherism, a brilliant illustration of working class people getting rich. Thatcher herself even used it with pride, saying in Parliament, "We've got a loads of money economy." Now, Harry Enfield, the creator of Loads of Money, held up a mirror, thinking it would show what he saw. He wanted to convey his truth about the Thatcher's policies and what they were doing to Britain. But people saw what they wanted to see, and he ended up making the opposite point to the one he intended for some audiences. And when he realised he was making things worse, he killed off Loads of Money by throwing him under a van. Very sad. So back to this century and something more hopeful. I did the ECF webinar with Dwayne and a group of people from the list a couple of weeks back. And I used the example of Live Aid to show how communicating crisis can make problems seem insurmountable and have a challenging impact on attitudes in the long term. It's a lesson that emerges through research on a wide range of issues. So the more stridently you articulate a problem, the less likely many people are to believe that it can be solved. And for me, this is one of these really big points that can potentially undermine all our work. And it kind of goes against our instinct that if something's bad or a situation needs to be tackled, we just want to tell people how bad it is and how important it is. But one of the participants in the webinar made the excellent point that fundraising needs can often take organisations towards crisis language because it can be very effective in encouraging donations. So I spoke to our friends at DevComms Lab. They run the Aid Attitudes Tracker and they have a large body of research on all of this. They shared with me an experiment that they ran to address this issue. They wanted to look at the unintended consequences of traditional crisis-focused appeals and the emotional impact and fundraising potential of alternatives that convey hope and agency. So these are the stimuli that they used, and really clear articulation of crisis versus something very different, both in terms of the imagery and the language used. And their conclusions were that, in terms of they approached this as an experiment, it was with a large group of people, and it was they're academics, so it was very robustly done. The two appeals generated the same amount of money, but the emotional responses that they elicited were very different. The traditional appeal made people feel guilty and angry, which made them more likely to donate, but it also made them feel repulsed and less hopeful, and therefore less likely to donate. It also lowered hope, which made people feel less able to make a difference. The alternative made people feel hopeful and have a sense of agency, which generated a willingness to donate. So what this experiment says to me, that in some contexts, crisis language can work, but there are consequences to it. The issue of agency is so important. So the idea that we might be telling people that this can't be solved seems to just undermine all our work and all our efforts. And I've seen it time and time again in focus groups and in interviews. We want to get across just how critical something is, but our language either shuts people down immediately or it conveys a sense that the problem is too big to be solved. So even if we do that and we follow up a crisis statement with a solution, the damage is already done. So there's loads of evidence on this on a range of issues, but this experiment is brand new and I think quite helpful. It's not published, but if anybody's interested in seeing it in full, I can share it. So grab me afterwards and I'll email it to you. So when it comes to talking about strategic communications and all of this stuff, I think it's one of those things that means very different things to different people and to different organisations. And not everyone has the ability to take a big step back and look at that big picture. And also, you know, when we're being targeted about who we want to talk to and what we want them to do, which is obviously often the case in campaigning, that's a really good thing. But I think we need to think about what we're saying to everyone else, or more importantly, what everyone else is hearing. And I think if the last year has taught us anything, it should be that wider public opinion matters and that we need to tell stories that appeal to a broader audience. So I wanted to finish by telling you one of my own stories. So last autumn, we heard about Kumbaka the gorilla escaping his enclosure at London Zoo. There was no danger, the zoo staff were keen to point out, which the word danger, just being part of that sentence, didn't feel massively reassuring. I go to the zoo a lot with my crazy daughters, and I don't think they'd do too well if they were to bump into Kumbaka. A week later, we heard that Kumbaka had downed 5 litres of undiluted blackcurrant squash during his bid for escape. And what that said to me and to my 3-year-old was, number 1, funny, and number 2, not scary. It felt immediately reassuring. If all he was doing was drinking squash, we didn't need to worry. And this was all about how I felt. I didn't read the report into his escape, being a neglectful, complacent parent. We just laughed and I felt reassured. We all do this all the time. We hear snapshots and we rely on our emotional responses and gut instincts to guide us. And I believe we need to do a much better job of crafting stories and messages that work with that reality. And I'd love to hear all of your thoughts and experiences in this space. So I'm not going to attempt to throw this ball because bad things will happen, but Dwayne has helpfully stepped in.
So who has some questions or comments? Mark, you ready?
Yeah, thanks. That was a very interesting presentation. I just wanted to know, how did you carry out the testing of different messages in the Human Rights campaign, or Human Rights Act campaign?
Sorry, could you repeat the last bit?
How did you carry out the testing of the different messages or different types of messages?
So we worked with expert researchers. We worked with a range of different ones, but on this one it was with YouGov. And the message testing, the bit that I think is the most valuable is called regression analysis. And so it's the idea that you're not just measuring agreement, but you're measuring the extent to which actually being exposed to a message has the potential to shift someone's view. I think that it's something that we don't do enough of, and they can help with that. There's lots of organisations that do it, but I found YouGov to be really helpful. It's also worth saying that there's also a lot of researchers that go into a lot more depth than that and go a lot further in terms of thinking about not just whether people agree or whether people disagree, but why and what are the underlying kind of patterns of thinking. So if you're interested in all of this, there's a whole world out there. If you haven't sort of dabbled in it, there's the Frameworks Institute in the States are, I think, really good when it comes to thinking about patterns, so thinking about the generic principles that we can apply. So they've done a lot on crisis language, and they do a lot about the kind of stories and metaphors that you can use to talk about certain issues productively, they call it. And then there's obviously, there's other organisations in the UK who are looking at it from different perspectives, but all with useful, I think really useful, valuable data and insights. So there's Chris Rose who does the kind of values mode, is that? Yeah, values mode stuff, which I've been looking at quite a lot recently. There's the Public Interest Research Centre. They look at all of this from a values point of view, and I think that it's so fascinating and it's so helpful. And there's a lot of learnings that are both kind of generic, so principles that we can apply to whatever issue you're talking about. But if you look into it, there's also probably stuff that applies to whatever it is you're campaigning and communicating as well. Everyone's terrified of this Paul.
Have other departments, so fundraising, advocacy, etc., been persuaded? How did you go about persuading them? How is it being implemented, this change in communication strategies?
So we don't have a fundraising department because we're slightly different in that we're kind of a programme of research that's specifically looking at this for a small organisation, but on behalf of a wide range of organisations. And I would say the extent to which different departments and different sort of different organisations or different departments in different organisations have got behind it has really varied. But I think there can be a sense of sort of shutting it down. So saying from a fundraising, or certainly from a media point of view, and my background before this was actually media, so I'm kind of well versed with the arguments as to why we should be sort of disregarding some of this thinking. I think that actually there are ways round some of the barriers that you can put up if you've got a traditional fundraising or a traditional media perspective. We just have to be much more creative about the story we're telling and how we're telling it. So the idea of, one of my big themes is around statistics, and when we reach for a statistic, often we're conveying something very different to what we think we're conveying, and actually we just need to think about what is the real point we're trying to make and how we best make it. That goes against everything I would have said previously, because I worked in media, and what you needed was a killer stat in order to get a great headline and to get the attention of journalists and to frame it in that way. But I've kind of come to realise that sort of it's actually much, sometimes when we do that, we're actually telling a too complicated story, or we're not in control of what people are hearing when they hear that statistic, and we need to be much cleverer about how we convey our messages. Is that helpful? I don't know.
Thank you very much. I particularly liked the Dev Lab experiment that you were showing.
Yeah.
And I found it quite encouraging because I work for CAFOD, and for a little while we've been trying to use that more hopeful language in everything we do. But I wondered whether, I think you said that was a recent piece of research. So I wonder if you know of any other pieces of research where they've done a similar thing, or other organisations have done a similar thing, but looked at the impact of like the second, third, fourth pieces of communication, because obviously most of us are in the business of building relationships. So I would have thought that the next conclusion would be that the more hopeful messaging leads people to have a longer term relationship. But I wonder if there's anything that you know about in terms of crisis language and long term relationships.
Yes, so they do an awful lot. They don't have a kind of public website at the moment, but apparently they're building one. And they, like us, have been a bit guarded and wary about the extent to which they just publish all their insight, because there's a danger that it can be used for the opposite purpose to the one that you want it to be used. Certainly on human rights, that's something that we've been very aware of. But they are moving towards publishing more of their research, but and they're going to be setting up a website. It's DevComs Lab, which isn't particularly snappy, but I think once they set up that website, there will be a load of interesting insight. And there's also a load of stuff from Bond, who have done a load of work looking at kind of the impact of big moments around Live Aid and subsequent kind of big moments that have captured public attention and what they've done in the long term in terms of attitudinal responses. So I'd direct you to both of those sources.
I'm interested in the research on the human rights, building support for the European Court of Human Rights. You said that the fact-based approaches didn't work. What messages did resonate with the public and did engage? So
on human rights, it was all about showing people how they were relevant to their life. So there's a big issue around kind of the othering of human rights and feeling like they traditionally are all about dictatorships and countries over there, and now they're all about criminals and terrorists in the UK. But actually, our research showed that if you can show people and talk to people about how they do matter day to day in everyone's lives, that can have a real impact. So the messages that tested best were all around stories and conveying how human rights benefit children, older people in care homes, which is part of why we made that film, and people with mental health problems. And we've got a whole load of kind of winning messages and winning frames. We're looking to kind of focus that in a bit more. So to say, okay, well, these are some snapshot messages, but actually what would a campaign specifically targeted at the 40% look like, and what would be the kind of the narrative of it? So we're doing some more work in that space, and I think again with all of this sort of audience insight research, you always want to go back for more. You sit on it and you process it and you kind of return to it and you think about what it's telling you. And I've had a bit of that moment recently because one of the things that the human rights research showed was that you need to tell stories about human rights, so real life case studies of how human rights have made a difference to lots of different types of people to kind of counter that othering. But actually, sometimes when you do that, that can, in a way, sort of further the sort of it's over there type response. If the stories you're telling just create this impression that it's just a random sample of kind of quite extreme situations that don't really feel like my life. And one of the other kind of default responses that people have to human rights is to say, but I'm fine, so I don't need them. And if you then try to counter that with, well, here's so-and-so who's disabled or has had an extreme mental health problem, and human rights helped that person in this situation, it just digs people in further to go, well, I'm fine, that's not me. So we need to work harder to think about, okay, how do we locate it much more squarely in people's own experiences, and what's helpful and what really helps us get over that default response.
So I wondered if you had any examples of campaigns which have used this more kind of hopeful language about generating agency, because I would say I'm kind of quite aware of this, but it's very difficult when you've got to get that email out and you've got to create a sense of a problem that needs to be solved, and obviously you want to give people agency, but I wondered if you had some good case studies, or maybe others can offer some examples of where they think it's really working.
So a few of the campaigns that I've really liked recently might not answer that question in terms of maybe kind of more of the sort of digital campaigning side of things, where I think that this is really, really tricky. But a few of the campaigns that I think have delivered a really hopeful message recently have been the Plan campaign, because I'm a girl, which starts with, when you see it, it starts with a very hopeful, positive message, and then moves on to articulation of the problem, but kind of then rounds it off with the idea that things can change, and I think that's done really nicely. I also really like the recent Bernardo's campaign, Believe in Children, which is sort of saying children aren't defined by the negative experience that they've had, and it's very emotional, it's very heartfelt, and it's very positive, albeit tackling some really difficult issues and some horrible issues around what children have experienced. So that's worth looking at. On the more detailed kind of examples of email-based kind of campaigning or similar. I'd love to hear from anyone else if they've got examples there. No one's done that.
There's a really fantastic researcher in the US called Harry Han, who has written quite a lot about this as well, and she's got some really practical examples. I'm trying to think of specific ones off the top of my head right now, but if you're searching, then Googling Harry Han would definitely produce some stories. Yeah.
Someone else.
Is there an example you want to add to that?
Yes, example.
Oh, hold on. Wait for the box so it's on the video.
So kind of using positive messages, this wasn't really a campaign, but in a previous role I did some work with Gendered Intelligence, who work with a lot of trans young people. And it was really interesting because they showed a video that some trans young people had made, which was like a kind of comedy skit, which was actually kind of mocking the fact that a lot of work, even by well-intended organizations, wants to portray like trans young people in their lives as like miserable, and they're on the brink of suicide, and isn't everything terrible, and therefore shouldn't you give money or help or whatever. And it really kind of turned that on its head and said, no, we want to hear positive stories, and it was young people making it, and I thought it was really funny and really great. But interestingly, the organisation I was working for at the same time was putting out this fundraising appeal, which basically was saying, this kid nearly ended their life, give us money. And I was like, no, that's not what is, that's not the kind of positive message people want to hear.
It's such short-term versus long-term.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to think about the long term. We have to think about where we're taking people when we talk like that, because it's not working, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicky. That was fantastic.
It's not such a hopeful note to end on.